Hello and welcome, everybody. With me today is Dr. Katherine Giscombe, who led the groundbreaking study on women of color in corporate management while she was at the nonprofit organization Catalyst, as well as designing several follow-up studies over the years, including research on women of color and mentoring and trust between women of color and others within the organization. Her current consulting work involves an examination of equity, equality, and fairness, and what organizations can do to enhance workplace inclusivity through a greater understanding and application of these concepts. To kind of set the scene here, Dr. Giscombe, why is
Mhm.
it important for us to be talking about what action organizations can be taking for women of color, not only in 2022, but in the future?
Sure. Well, clearly, women of color are a very large part of the talent pool out there. And we know that the more that organizations are savvy about using their talent, the more profitable they will be. And importantly, for just the careers of people within the organization, they really need to be very objective at looking at the talent that exists in their organization. I mean, we know from various studies that even still, corporate managers may have some prejudice about who's talented, who looks like they belong in the upper ranks, et cetera. But there's a lot of effort that's been done to really disabuse corporate managers of this kind of viewpoint. And I did want to just cite some work that Catalyst has done in terms of getting senior women on boards. So a former colleague, Misha Rosa, has done a lot of work at Catalyst with getting women of color board ready.
Mm.
And I think it's very important that people in corporations know that sponsorship is very important for advancing everybody in the talent pool. And there can be kind of a disconnect in terms of perhaps senior managers not being as comfortable with people who are different from them, but it really pays dividends to reach across those barriers and see the talent that exists within the entire workforce. And again, sponsorship is a little bit tricky. It's not like mentoring. It's giving your sponsee a lot of tactical and strategic advice about how to increase the power that they have within their roles and what they need to do, what inside information they need to have in order to advance within their corporation and be seen as somebody who is ready for membership on a corporate board.
Okay, so I'm really looking forward to diving into
Mhm.
more of that presently. Before
Mhm.
we do that, I am going to pivot to our audience, and
Mhm.
my question for those who are tuning in is, what would be one clear indicator that organizations are taking action for women and specifically women of color in meaningful ways? So, as we're waiting for people to kind of respond to that question, let's move into the questions that we've developed for today. So,
Mhm.
first up, what I'd like to hear more of from you is, how can business organizations better support women of color at all levels within
Mhm.
organizations? And
Mhm.
emphasis on all levels there.
Yeah, I think that's an important way of framing that question because we know that typically organizations with their diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts tend to look just at the salaried workers or the managerial workers. But in fact, there certainly is a lot of evidence that people at lower levels in the organization are not having a very positive quality of work. So there was some work done a couple of years ago by Berkeley University, about just the way that people who work in warehouses who are fulfilling orders, their quality of work life is very, very low.
I've heard, yeah.
So organizations need to realize that, for example, when they do future of work conferences, they don't just need to have the senior people being represented, but they need to have lower level people who are actually doing the hands-on work to keep the organization moving. And there's been, I think, a bit of a resistance for some business organizations seeing those lower level workers as, obviously, to me at least, completely integral to their efforts at being successful.
Yeah. So, if we're digging a little deeper here,
Mhm.
what more can organizations do?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, for example, they can look more carefully at the working conditions of people within the lower ranks. and they can give them, for example, more breaks. I don't know if you've heard stories about what it's like to work in warehouses fulfilling orders, but the quality of work life is quite terrible. And in some fulfillment centers, there have been reports of injuries of people lifting heavy loads, boxes that they really shouldn't have to. So, in order to just protect the health of their workforce, organizations need to be paying a little bit more attention to those who are lower in the ranks of their workforces.
That
And
makes
by the
a lot of
way,
sense.
there are a lot of people of color who are overrepresented in those types of jobs. So that's one of my key concerns at this point.
Right. And the companion to that is there are certain demographic groups that are overrepresented in the boardroom as well.
That's
Is that fair
exactly
to say?
true. That's exactly right. Yeah. So
So,
we start at the boardroom in terms of, getting more diverse representation there, and hopefully over time there will be some effects on the lower levels of the organization. But I think my message to corporate managers is, when you're looking at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion plans, please look carefully at your entire workforce, not just the salaried workers.
yeah, and I think it's worth repeating here, but those hourly workers are, during the pandemic, people have been referring to them as essential workers. And just to be
Yeah.
super clear about this, a lot of those roles are foundational to the society that we've built and exist in.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really true.
I will also pivot back just quickly to the audience question. We've got our guest from last time, Christina Smith, chiming in here with a clear indicator would be advocating for women when they're not in the room. But I think this also speaks to this thread of conversation that we're talking here. And Dr. Enan Rudell, an associate of mine, chimes in just to kind of support that. And Catherine, I don't know if you'd like to speak to that point about advocating for women when they are not in the room, but it does
Mhm,
seem like an
mhm.
important point.
Oh, very much. Certainly, in looking at the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts among corporate organizations, we see sometimes that there is almost an invisibility that happens with women of color. Like suddenly, people forget about the contributions that they've made to their departments, to the overall business. And it's kind of interesting that, there is a deep kind of prejudice at work here. I mean, there's been a lot of work on bias within organizations, and a lot of academic work, a lot of hands-on work about surfacing that bias and trying to eradicate it. So certainly there is a type of invisibility, unfortunately, that happens with women of color. I mean, stereotypes are very pervasive, so a lot of people within corporate organizations simply don't think of women of color as being the type of person that they would expect to see in a high level position, even though they're obviously quite talented and have made many contributions to their business. But eradicating that prejudice is difficult, but there are organizations who are very on top of things and who are really training their managers to see their workers in a three-dimensional way.
So, I know that you are somebody who you, of course, are a woman of color yourself.
Mhm.
You, of course, you are a founder of an organization. You have been able to hold high-level positions. And I'm just curious to hear some
Mm,
of your perhaps personal reflections on getting there, because
mhm,
I
mhm,
mean, it couldn't have been easy.
mm. Well, I have, when I tell people, when I talk about my work life, I say, don't try this at home because I had kind of an unusual career path. So I got a PhD in organizational psychology many years ago at the University of Michigan, and I wasn't quite invested in that degree.
Hmm.
This is many years ago before there was a lot of effort around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I happened to like surveys. I liked analyzing surveys and seeing what they, told clients about what was going on. And I pivoted to marketing research for about 10 years.
Oh.
So I was a woman of color in corporate management for all those years. And it was really eye-opening. The
Mm.
level of prejudice that I encountered uh, was quite breathtaking. I mean, certainly when I was in school, I went to a very liberal university, the University of Michigan. I personally just didn't feel that kind of bias as a student. But then working, and I was again in marketing research for several years, I could see the dynamics of like who was listened to, who was valued over someone else. I think a classic example is I had a young white woman who worked for me, who I was doing her evaluation, and I gave her just kind of an average on, I think it was interpersonal skills. And she was very, very upset about this because she said, I have really good interpersonal skills. Yeah, that convinced me, right?
Right.
It
Yeah.
went over my head to my boss,
Wow.
who basically told me that I had to fix basically, her what I'd written down about her skills in this performance evaluation, and I had to be very strategic and thinking, okay, I don't want to completely give in and say, oh yes, you've got great interpersonal skills. So I think what I did was I lowered her performance on one attribute, which was communication, saying, you really do need to communicate more carefully with everyone that you work with, because I've heard, XYZ in terms of how you've communicated. So I lowered one attribute, and then to compromise, I raised the attribute on the interpersonal skills. I said, yeah, informally, you've got great interpersonal skills, but you really do have to watch your communication with others in other departments. So to
Mm.
have to go through that kind of compromise is
Yeah.
something that I did not see my white coworkers going through.
Yeah.
So just being silenced, having to look for compromises in how I did my work and how I was judged.
Right. Yeah, so I can see clearly there that there's a lot of emotional labor there and certainly just
Mhm,
additional mental resources that
mhm,
over the length of a career, excuse me, could really
mhm,
add up to a
mhm.
lot of additional strain. So,
Oh, but I just want to say something else about marketing. I
please.
was really glad to have a marketing background because when it came time to release the first big project I did at Catalyst on women of color in corporate management,
Yeah.
there was another organization that seemed to be doing some similar work. And we kind of wanted to beat them to the punch. We wanted to release our study before they released theirs. And so, even though it wasn't a great time of year to be releasing a report, I really pushed saying, the first one in the marketplace is the one who owns the marketplace. So,
Mhm.
based on that advice, we did get the report out very quickly, and it got a lot of publicity. And it really, I think, helped put Catalyst on the map as an organization that really cared and was doing, very generative things for women of color.
Yeah, that's incredible. We've had a couple other comments come in again from Christina Smith. So I think responding to the personal story you were just sharing sounds very familiar. For those who are listening in, Christina Smith is also a member of the DiVerity community and
Mhm,
also a very highly accomplished practitioner in her own
mhm,
right. And if
mhm,
you'd like to learn more about her, then you can check out our last episode.
mhm.
Another LinkedIn user writes, "The tightrope we walk as
Yeah,
women of color."
yeah.
Right.
Still, yeah, after all these years.
And Tara Robertson, a an advisor for DiVerity,
Mhm.
is chiming in here and just singing your praises and support. It's so good you spoke up. Wonderful. So, to pivot back to our questions, what
Mhm,
impact can we expect to see if organizations are better able to support women and especially women of color at all levels in real ways, but
mhm,
especially when it comes to reproductive health?
mm. Yeah, that's That's the question that really is on a lot of people's minds right now,
Yeah.
especially, well, concerning reproductive health with what's happened with the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So I and many others are deeply concerned about the effects on women of color.
Of
And,
course.
that's one reason that I wanted to talk about the hourly workers at the
Mhm.
beginning of our segment
Mhm, mhm.
for organizations not to discount the well-being of these workers. So, in doing some research on just the presence of women of color in business, and also looking at disparities in treatments regarding health, there has been an estimation that because of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, there's going to be a 33% higher death rate among Black women who are
33%.
33% higher death rate for pregnancies, given
Wow.
that they're not going to be allowed to terminate a pregnancy that they do not want. So that's, looking again at, I just did some analyses with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there are approximately 16 million women of color of reproductive age in the workforce in the United States.
Wow.
So when you think about that huge number, there are just so many deleterious effects that are going to happen. And I know with both Asian women and Hispanic women, just doing some research quickly, sometimes there's a language barrier
Yeah.
that may keep them from accessing reproductive health services. And clearly, it's going to be much harder to access those services, given that many states have enacted a total ban on on abortion for any reason, even to this sounds really terrible, but it seems that even to save the life of the mother, that there could be instances where certain procedures are withheld from women when they're pregnant because it might harm a fetus.
Yeah, I've been seeing these headlines, and I think it bears repeating here that all of this is going to be added on top of all the already existing and exacerbated inequities that women of color already face. Is that
That's really
accurate?
true. And I have wrote an op-ed and my editor is shopping it around. And I really, I don't know if the major publications are going to print my op-ed, but I did at least want to share something I found out in doing this research.
Yeah, please.
And there was actually investigative reporting done by a magazine, Business Insider, and it talked about how there was a disconnect between organizations that have really good diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on paper. And yet, a lot of these organizations have contributed millions of dollars to support trigger bans in states about to overturn Roe v. Wade. And I
Mm,
was kind of shocked. I
yeah.
remember that it was like AT&T and other telecommunication organizations that had contributed money to these trigger bans. Now, these organizations have very good diversity, equity, and inclusion programs for their employees, and yet there's a contradiction there
Yeah.
in terms of supporting this kind of initiative that, again, I'm just so struck by the data about the 33% higher death rate among African American women. And, going back to another story that was in the papers, like I guess a couple of years ago now, there is such prejudice out there that you might remember Serena Williams when she was giving birth, she was having difficulties.
Mhm.
And, she's obviously very sharp, very smart. She knew what was going on with her and was trying to explain to the medical caretakers what they needed to do. And they dismissed her. I mean,
Right.
she really had to be extremely aggressive about saying, this is what's going on with me and you need to do XYZ. So unfortunately, prejudice is so, I think, almost hardwired into our society that it is obviously very difficult for people to break through that prejudice and see women of color as, just full citizens, who are who really need all the rights that other people in the United States have.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that's such a great example because that's somebody that so many look up to and
Hmm.
who is widely admired for their strength, their skill, their
Hmm.
thoughtfulness and how they play the game. And yet they can
Hmm.
so easily be dismissed and reduced to,
Hmm.
uh, if we're being frank here, be dehumanized, right? In spite
Yeah,
of
yeah.
all of that accomplishment,
Hmm.
when it
Hmm.
really mattered, the most, was just able to be dehumanized, categorized, and
Hmm.
dismissed.
And that's how deeply prejudice runs in this country, and quite frankly, other countries as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to pivot to our audience again. So, what I'd like to get some insight from those tuning in right now is, if you could jump ahead 1 year into the future, what would you like to see organizations accomplish through better supporting the reproductive health of women, especially women of color? So I'll leave that question up here for a moment. But to move on into our next question, so what are principled organizations doing right to support women of color post Roe v. Wade or after following the SCOTUS
Hmm.
decision?
Oh, well, actually, there were several organizations that have been contributing money to help women needing abortions, for example, travel to other states that allow that legally now still allow abortions. So that's a major contribution, and certainly, I and and other women are grateful that so many companies are doing this.
Got it. Yeah. So, hmm. If we're kind of thinking about the role of DEI practitioners in supporting
Mm,
organizations
mhm,
in staying the course on what they've committed to for DEI, but also what they've committed to doing for women, not just following the SCOTUS decision, but even before that.
mhm,
Um, you know, how can, in your mind, how can DEI practitioners have like a greater impact? Or
mm.
is that even a possibility?
Oh, I think it's a possibility. I think that they need to have really hard conversations with business leaders about how sometimes some of their priorities or their practices may be working against the women of color within their organization. And I think a good example, again, is the number of organizations that contributed, millions of dollars to the trigger ban on abortions. Uh, I mean, clearly there was some belief behind that. I'm sure that there's a reason that they wanted to do that. It could have been the personal beliefs of the very senior people within organizations, but it would be so good if business organizations could take just a deeper look at the entire lives of the women of color who are working in their organizations. And again, not just managerial and salaried workers, but the lower level workers who are going to be most vulnerable to something like the overturn of Roe v. Wade.
Gotcha. Yeah, as we were talking here, something that kind of crossed my mind is so much of the work that we're trying to advance with diversity, equity, and inclusion stems from people just kind of overlooking other people's humanity, right? So
Hmm.
getting too locked
Hmm.
into what they're trying to accomplish organizationally or what have you. But I don't know.
Hmm.
Just kind of in the moment here, in your mind, is it even possible for organizations to operate in a
Hmm.
way where they are continually kind of thinking and centering people's humanity? Because the pattern seems to
Hmm.
be that indicating that that is not the default.
Hmm. Well, actually, that's a question that I'm going to try to answer. I'm chairing a panel at the Academy of Management in about 3 weeks. It'll be in
Fantastic.
Seattle. August 9th is when we're doing our panel. And we're actually, I've got a number of experts with me who are looking at how business organizations can more deeply look at systemic inequity. And ironically, business organizations are basically the recipients of inequity with these enormous tax breaks that they get.
Yeah.
And just the millions of dollars that very senior people in the organization are paid. So to recognize that there's a huge gap between the quality of life at the very senior levels and the quality of life at the very lower levels in organizations is kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
And actually, I think we're probably going to quote from a researcher named Maura Barak, who talked about how business organizations can become just more humane in terms of just broadening their definition of who their stakeholders are. So traditionally, the major stakeholder for corporate organizations is the shareholders.
Yeah.
You want to increase what monies the shareholders get based on what your organization's doing. But in fact, what More Barak advocates is corporate organizations just expanding this list of stakeholders to include the community in which they're located and even the nation. And in
Mm.
that regard, I suspect that if business organizations took this to heart, they probably wouldn't, want to contribute money to the trigger bans, that happened after Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, so interesting to hear you say that. I remember in grad school learning, when I was studying organizational conflict, that
Mm-hmm.
organizations often, well, whether they realize it or not, they are embedded in the communities from which their workforce is drawn. And
Right.
so the conflict dynamics that people experience within those communities often get drawn into the organization simply
Hmm.
by people
Hmm.
being present there, right?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
we have this idea that there's this division of our professional life and our personal life, but if we're being real here, it's the same person sitting in the office
Hmm.
chair
Hmm.
as sits down in the easy chair,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that false separation does not serve us well.
Hmm. And also, what's happened is that more and more, just the hours that people contribute to working. I mean, with the advent of the internet, I
Yeah,
mean, suddenly, you may be on call throughout the weekend.
true.
It's very common to get a series of emails from coworkers, from bosses, and, time that should be spent just relaxing, recharging, being away from work isn't really part of the equation anymore. I mean, just objectively having worked for so many years, I can see the differences in the hours that people expect to be working every week, say 30 years ago versus now. And it's a huge
Mm,
difference. It's a
yeah.
huge difference.
Yeah, that's a huge burden on, again, mental health, which is another
Mhm.
hot topic right now, and not for no
Mhm.
reason. We've got another comment that's come in here, and I think this is in response to the audience question, which was what they would like to see if we could
Ah,
fast forward a year from now is advocating for systemic change while supporting individuals in their orgs. And I think that speaks very well to what you were saying earlier. To kind of close out intentionally here, I wonder if we can drill down to maybe something a little bit concrete for those who have tuned in. And what's on my mind is, like, let's say that somebody is tuning in to watch us today and, really processing the information and those great statistics that you've sketched out for us. What is something that they can be doing themselves in their workplace, in their life,
mhm,
to contribute to,
mhm,
improving
mhm, mhm, mhm,
the conditions for women everywhere?
mhm, mhm. I think forming deeper relationships with others in the workplace, getting to know them as individuals, and being sure that you're judging them objectively based on their talents. And also just being, well, less prejudiced in terms of being able to see talent in people who look different from you.
Yeah, and I love that for you it came down to relationships, So one way that
Mhm.
I look at opportunities for equity, it often falls along developing our knowledge, developing our communication skills, or developing our relationships, and often some mixture of all three.
Mhm.
We also know, and my background is in conflict resolution, that when
Mhm.
you have a relationship, then it's a lot easier to invest in navigating conflicts, small ones, large social conflicts like the conflicts we're going through right now. But if we remain kind of numbers or faceless other people or job titles to others, then it's really hard for them to connect with our humanity. And,
Mhm.
if we're
Mhm.
not reaching the hearts and minds kind of space, then motivation can often be in short supply.
Mhm.
Any final thoughts as we close out here, Dr. Giscombe?
Just that I hope that people are very conscious of seeing their coworkers, people who report to them, their bosses, as three-dimensional human beings with lots of complexities, and making an effort to get to know the people that they work with beyond just the tasks that they do within the workplace.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your time. And I know this
Well,
was
thank
not
you.
an easy episode for us to put together, but just really valuing your insight, your knowledge, and your expertise. And thank you so much for everything.
Oh, and thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in. That's our show. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another guest. And till then, be well, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.